The last of the food ran out days ago, but the barren landscape that sprawls out as far as the eye can see offers nothing but rock, ice, and snow. You and the other survivors are slowly wasting away. Your bodies have already begun to digest their own muscles, and soon, one by one, you'll each be reduced to just another frozen body in the snow. So you are left with two choices: do the unthinkable or die. That's when you think back to years ago, when 3 of your friends died in a canoe accident, and how your mother had said if that had been you, if she had lost a son, she would never have recovered. The thought of your mother grieving snaps you back to reality. You know what you have to do, even at the risk of forsaking your humanity. You walk over to one of your friends' bodies in the snow, and using a broken piece of glass from the wreckage, you make the first incision. You hand out a tiny piece to each survivor, and as you stare at your share, there is a dead silence. October 12th, 1972. A rugby team from Uruguay had chartered a flight for a match in Santiago, Chile. The 19 young men were hyped about the 4-day trip, the sightseeing, and freedom from their day-to-day responsibilities it would bring. For some of the team members, it was the very first time they would be on a plane. The rest of the seats were filled with family and supporters of the Old Christians Club rugby union team. The pilot in charge, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, was an experienced Air Force pilot with over 5,000 flying hours and had crossed the Andes 29 times. His co-pilot in training, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguera, was also a former Air Force pilot. The 5 crew members had 40 passengers on board for Flight 571 on a Fairchild FH-227D taking off from Montevideo. Due to a storm, the pilot decided to stop over in Mendoza, Argentina and continue their journey the next day. But after taking off, even with the extra stop, the skies didn't clear up. The pilots opted to take a longer U-shaped route through the Andes through Planchon Pass instead of going over the mountains, since the aircraft's max height was 28,000 feet. With the co-pilot, Dante Hector Laguera, on the controls, the plane navigated through the clouds. The pilots, relying on radio navigation, thought the plane had almost reached Curacao, which was their signal to start preparing for descent towards their final destination, Santiago. Except, the plane was actually 37 miles away from their original estimate. The clouds grew thicker as they descended and hit a storm. The pilots told the passengers to brace themselves for turbulence, cautioning that they were going to dance about a bit. As the plane hit a low-pressure area and dropped in altitude, the players were unconcerned. They even cheered and threw a rugby ball around. The plane hit another air pocket and rapidly descended several hundred feet. Still, the rugby players never thought anything was wrong. That was until one of them, Francisco Panchito Abal, asked, "Is it normal to fly this close?" As he pointed out the window, suddenly, mountains loomed into their view. It seemed that they were just a few hundred feet away. As the plane descended out of the clouds, the pilots noticed their grave mistake and attempted to pull up, pushing the throttle full speed. The climb was so abrupt that their near-vertical ascent caused the plane's engine to shudder to a stall, shaking violently as co-pilot Laguerra struggled to regain control. It was too late. They couldn't make it over the mountain ridge. The back of the plane clipped the craggy face of the mountain and propelled the fuselage downward. The right wing hit some rocks, shearing it clean off, sending it slicing through the back of the plane. The plane's back split and fell as 5 passengers and 2 crew members in the back section were thrown out to their deaths. The left wing hit an outcropping and broke off. The remaining body of the plane smashed into a snowbank so violently that the seats flew forward and the cockpit was crushed like a tin can. 12 people had died in the initial crash, including Joaquin Ramirez, a flight attendant, Gaston Costamale, one of the rugby players, and Dr. Francisco Nicola, the team's physician. The pilot, Julio Cesar Ferradas, was also one of the unfortunate victims, crushed to death along with the cockpit's cabin. The co-pilot, Dante Hector Laguerra, was pinned in the wreckage and losing blood rapidly. He begged for one of the passengers to end his misery with his revolver that was somewhere in the debris, but none of the remaining survivors could bring themselves to take a life. Eventually, he succumbed to his injuries that night, along with 4 others who were in critical condition. After the crash, there were only 28 survivors out of 45, many with injuries. Some of the passengers had broken legs, crushed from the impact when the seats collapsed. But this wasn't the only challenge they would have to face. The plane had crashed on a glacier almost 12,000 feet up in the Mendoza province of Argentina, surrounded by the mountains of the Andes as far as the eye could see. What would come next was a test like no other, particularly for those who had never encountered snow, now confronted with drifts that reached chest height in some areas. With the team physician dead, a couple of the young rugby players stepped up. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino from the team were both first-year medical students. The two of them tended to the wounded by draining infections from legs and stabilizing fractures. They also carted off dead bodies so that the rest of the group could focus on figuring out how to survive until help arrived. Despite being unprepared, the group was smart. They had to be resourceful in order to stay alive. Food was very limited. They only had 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, a tin of almonds, 3 tiny jars of jam, some dates, dried plums, candies, and several bottles of wine. Marcelo Perez, the team rugby captain, was appointed as a leader. He made sure the supplies were rationed very carefully and nobody fought over it. Some days were as little as 1 square of chocolate and 1 capful of wine. Luckily, water was in abundance, only it was in crystallized form. Eating snow would give them severe cramps from the cold, so they created a simple contraption, a collector with aluminum sheeting from the seats that would reflect the sun to melt it into water. The survivors used the fuselage for shelter and blocked the wind with suitcases. Sunglasses were fashioned out from the plastic screens of the pilot's cabin, snowshoes from the bottoms of seats, blankets from the wool lining of the seats, and hammocks from cables and cords for those with broken legs. The group even found a transistor radio and made an antenna to listen to stations and get updates on the search and rescue efforts. In the meantime, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service had been notified that Flight 571 was nowhere to be found. An operation had started to look for the missing plane, with a joint effort between Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. But the extensive search area, bitter weather conditions, and the white fuselage on the white snow made it nearly impossible to find them. In fact, the survivors saw 3 planes during the search, but even though they tried writing SOS on the roof of the airplane and used some of the suitcases to form a cross on the snow, their efforts were not able to attract any attention from the planes passing over their heads. After 8 days, due to the harsh weather and the belief there was little chance of survival, authorities called off the search. Through the crackle of the radio, the survivors would hear the words they dreaded the most, that no one was looking for them. With their heads hung low, they sobbed and prayed. But one boy, Gustavo Nikolic, seeing the hopelessness spreading through the group, exclaimed, "Hey boys, there's some good news. We're going to get out if you're on our own." It was his upbeat, goal-focused attitude that kept them from falling into despair. So volunteers trekked out into the desolate white landscape. Not only were the perilous slopes and peaks dangerous, but their heads pounded and the mountains spun as they suffered from altitude sickness and malnourishment. Even if the trekkers pushed through it, they could only travel so far before nightfall came with deadly temperatures. With no shelter, they had to travel back before it turned dark. This greatly hindered them, so they had to put the idea on ice. Several days after the crash, even with their careful rationing, food eventually started to run out, so the group tried to eat anything remotely edible they could find, like cotton and leather from the plane seats. Some of them even got sick from trying makeup powder and cologne. Despite these efforts, they weren't getting the energy they needed to look for help in this treacherous terrain, let alone increase their odds of survival. As the group starved, their muscles were wasting away. On the brink of death, led to desperation, the survivors looked upon their fallen, frozen comrades. Given their critical situation, this was their sole remaining source of sustenance, offering fat and protein vital for their survival. The bones, meanwhile, would be able to provide nutrients like calcium, potassium, and magnesium. But could the survivors really go through with an act that they considered taboo? One night, huddled in the cold shelter of the fuselage, they had a difficult but crucial discussion. Marcelo Perez and the others knew that if they didn't do this, then death would soon find them. So the group all made a pact that if anybody died, they would give up their own flesh to the living. And so, Roberto Canessa, one of the medical students, made the first incision with a piece of glass. As he was used to medical procedures, he could look at it clinically. After taking the first bite, he then sliced toothpick-sized pieces and handed them out. Some had strong aversions due to their religious convictions, but eventually, they were persuaded by their companions that it was like communion. After some time, the survivors were able to stomach the flesh, as well as what they had done in desperation. But to make it more palatable, they freeze-dried strips on top of the plane, turning them into jerky. As their meat supply dwindled, the group resorted to eating the brains and other internal organs, and even ground the bones into powder to get the nutrients they were lacking. As if things weren't dire enough, tragedy struck on the 17th night. A blizzard hit, piling snow precariously on a nearby slope while the survivors slept. The winds were howling through the rocks, destabilizing the snow pile, tipping its weight over. It broke off. The shelter shook violently as a roar rushed towards the survivors. When the avalanche hit, it smothered the shelter, filling it up with snow, trapping everyone inside. It was like being buried in cement as the group struggled to dig themselves out to avoid asphyxiation. Some managed to crawl into the 3 feet of space left by the snow. Unfortunately, 8 didn't make it out. With air running out in the tiny space, those who had survived poked a hole through a window to provide ventilation. After a day inside, those who now survived 2 disastrous events finally dug a hole through the snow, only to find the furious blizzard. So they went back inside and stayed there for 3 days as they weathered the storm. Unfortunately, the avalanche was a huge blow to the survivors' mental state, especially because their appointed leader, Marcelo Perez, had died in the avalanche. The avalanche had also buried their only food source that they had painstakingly harvested. But it also gave the remaining group the push they needed to venture out further for help. So they appointed 3 new leaders, Daniel Fernandez, Eduardo Strauch, and his cousin Fito Strauch, and then started to trek out. On the 33rd day, during an expedition, the trekkers came across the tail section of the plane where they found a little bit of food, comics, and more importantly, a 2-way radio. Hoping they'd be able to use it to call for help, the trio loaded the things up along with a battery they found among the wreckage onto a suitcase fashioned as a sled and brought it back to camp. One of the survivors, who was studying electronics, tried desperately to connect the battery to the radio. Unfortunately, the battery wasn't the right voltage. It was all for nothing. This failed attempt was met with despair, making the stark reality of their isolation even more profound. Nobody was coming, and they could not call for help. The survivors' numbers were dwindling from both the elements and illnesses like gangrene. It felt as if they were just delaying their inevitable deaths. But the remaining survivors still didn't give up hope and were determined to find help, except there was still the problem of not being able to take shelter at night for longer expeditions. So using copper wire, insulation from the rear of the fuselage, and the waterproof fabric that covered the air conditioning, one of the boys quilted a sleeping bag large enough for 3 people to be used by the ones taking the risk. By this point, the group was low on meat. Despite this, they gave 3 days worth of food to the 3 venturing out, Nando Parado, Antonio Vizintin, and Roberto Canessa. The trio started climbing up one of the mountains. What became very clear was that it would take them far more than 3 days to reach the top. So Antonio turned back to camp in order to ensure the expedition team's food could last longer. Without climbing equipment, the remaining 2 boys did whatever it took, even risking their lives. When faced with a vertical wall made of ice and snow, Nando chipped away footholds into it with a stick so they could climb. Finally reaching the summit, Nando and Roberto eagerly searched for the welcoming sight of trees and grass in the distance. Instead, their hearts sank when all they found were more mountains, endlessly stretching before them. However, a glimmer of hope emerged when they spotted a valley below. The boys ventured into the valley, which led to a river, which they followed. On the 6th day, the 2 boys found that the grass was in fact much greener on the other side. They found vegetation, a horseshoe, a rusted soup can, lizards scurrying around, and even some cattle, but no one tending to them. By this point, Nando and Roberto had no food and no energy. Even though they weren't in the icy mountains anymore, they were on thin ice. By the 10th day of the trek, they had traveled 38 miles. As they were building a fire to rest, they saw 3 men on horseback on the other side of the river. The 2 boys got up and ran to the river's edge, shouting and waving their hands. The rushing water made it almost impossible to be heard, but the 2 tried regardless. Just when it seemed hopeless, One of the men, Sergio Catalan, turned around. He was a muleteer, transporting goods using pack animals. He tried to yell back, but again, the water was too loud, so Sergio yelled to them, "Tomorrow!" Sergio threw a rock over the river with a paper and pen attached with a string for the duo. Roberto wrote, "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come to fetch us? Please, we cannot even walk. Where are we?" After Roberto threw the rock back, Sergio read the note and indicated he understood. He threw some bread at them and then rode tirelessly for 10 hours to get help. He came across another muleteer on the other side of the river and told the man to bring the 2 survivors to Los Metens, while Sergio continued on horseback. He notified the police, who then informed the army. The muleteer arrived and retrieved the boys. They were finally rescued. The survivors at the crash hadn't heard from Nando and Roberto for 11 days. They were near death and had no idea if their 2 friends were even alive at this point. After being stranded for more than 70 days, hope was fading. Then, the sound of an engine echoed in the mountains. Looking upwards, the group saw 2 helicopters peek over the mountain and head right for them. The survivors couldn't believe it. Nando and Roberto directed the search and rescue operators to the crash site, and when they landed, the survivors rejoiced, hugging everybody within reach. In the end, 16 of the original 45 survived after 72 days in the Andes. Since there were too many people to fit into the helicopters, the rescuers had to make a second trip in the morning, leaving behind some of the rescuers to stay with the camp overnight. The survivors were treated for numerous things after the ordeal, like frostbite, altitude sickness, scurvy, and of course, malnutrition, but they were finally saved. Aware of the sensitivities surrounding their ordeal, the survivors felt it was disrespectful to speak about cannibalism publicly before they had a chance to communicate with the families of the crash victims privately. However, the press started to speculate and ask questions. It didn't take much for them to speculate cannibalism. Originally, the public was appalled. So to clear things up, a press conference was held at the Old Christians College to explain everything that transpired. And in the end, the public sentiment shifted to empathy, with people commending the survivors for their fortitude. A priest even said they wouldn't be damned, given the extreme circumstances, to ease their conscience. The remains of the victims were later buried in a common grave at the site, with a stone altar, a cross, and a plaque, while the remaining portion of the plane was burned. Since then, the survivors have occasionally visited the site to pay their respects. At the end of the day, in the most dire circumstances, the need for survival makes you realize that life can dish out the most bitter choices. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to our channel. You'd be surprised to know how big of an impact your 1 sub has on this video's success. Plus, we've got plenty more mysteries coming that you won't want to miss. So, until next time, thanks for watching, and hope to see you again soon.